The Clone Wars brought about a renaissance for naval shipbuilding, and they also fundamentally changed the kinds of ships that major military powers built their fleets around. For millennia, the judicial forces and the Old Republic Navy had primarily relied on large numbers of smaller, more agile capital ships, a mix of corvettes, frigates, and cruisers, both in wartime and peacetime. During the Clone Wars, however, naval doctrine shifted to focus on new, enormous capital ships, some of them bigger than any ship the Republic had ever built before. These juggernauts of the Republic Navy, the Star Destroyers and their larger cousins, would completely change the way naval warfare worked in the Star Wars universe. In this video, we'll be taking a detailed look at every single one of the Republic Navy's Star Destroyers and larger capital ships, from the famous Venator-class Star Destroyer to its less well-known cousins. When the Republic Navy was reinstated at the start of the Clone Wars, it initially relied primarily on the Mandator-class assault ship that the Kaminoans had commissioned as part of the Clone Army project, alongside a number of smaller capital ships drawn from the judicial forces and planetary security forces. But as the war went on, the Republic Navy began to make use of larger and more powerful classes of capital ship. The Acclamator was shunted out of the limelight to make way for the Venator-class Star Destroyer, which was eventually followed by a series of even more powerful warships. The history of the Star Destroyer began at the start of the Clone Wars, when the Republic, impressed by the performance of the large and heavily armed Acclamator-class assault ship, sought to develop new, even larger capital ship designs to serve as the backbone of its navy. Specifically, the Republic wanted what Kuat Drive Yards called a Star Destroyer, a large command ship that could function both as a heavily armed naval linchpin and a starfighter carrier. This joint venture was known as the Victor Initiative Project, and it saw the Republic enlist shipbuilding rivals Kuat Drive Yards and Rendili Star Drive to create a next-generation warship. Under the leadership of two legendary shipwrights, Walex Blissex and his daughter Lyra, the Victor Initiative set to work developing the first of this new class of warship, the Victory-class Star Destroyer. But tensions between KDY and Rendili Star Drive, as well as between the two Blissexes, stalled the production of the Victory class, which ultimately wasn't deployed until 20 BBY. Though the Victory was still remembered as the first Star Destroyer, it was actually preceded by a later variant design, the Venator-class Star Destroyer. Unlike the Victory, the Venator wasn't a joint project. It was designed solely by Lyra Blissex for Kuat Drive Yards. The success of the Venator, as well as a separatist coup on Rendili late in the Clone Wars, ensured that KDY would have a monopoly on Star Destroyer production going into the Imperial era. Although the term Star Destroyer was a KDY trademark, it was nonetheless integrated into the new standard capital ship classification developed during the Clone Wars, the Anaxis War College system. According to this classification system, Star Destroyers were all capital ships between 1,000 and 2,000 kilometers in length, as well as a few slightly smaller and slightly larger vessels whose armament and mission profile were more suited to Star Destroyer than a heavy cruiser or battlecruiser. In anticipation of the development of even larger capital ships, the Anaxis War College system also included two even larger capital ship classes, Battlecruisers and Dreadnaughts. Battlecruisers were between 2,000 and 5,000 meters in length, and, depending on mission profile, ships that fell into this class were sometimes sorted into subclasses. The smallest battlecruisers, for instance, were sometimes classified as star cruisers, while some especially well-armed battlecruisers were instead classified as battleships. Any capital ship longer than 5,000 meters was considered a dreadnought, the largest, rarest, and most feared capital ship of all. With the exception of the Victory-class Star Destroyer, which was a joint project with Rendili Star Drive, every single Republic capital ship in these three classes was manufactured by Kuat Drive Yards. Let's start with the most iconic Republic capital ship, the Venator-class Star Destroyer. Designed by Lyra Blissex for Kuat Drive Yards, the Venator was technically the second oldest ship of the Star Destroyer line, but it was the first to see combat. Designed with lessons from the performance of the Acclamator-class assault ship in mind, the Venator-class Star Destroyer was first deployed in late 22 BBY, several months into the Clone Wars. Over the course of the conflict, many thousands of these imposing vessels were built above loyalist shipbuilding worlds, from the great artificial rings of Kuat itself to the Alantine 6 shipyards. Almost immediately after its introduction, the Venator-class practically took over the Republic Navy, replacing the Acclamator as the Navy's main heavy-hitting warship, and it would remain the Navy's backbone until the end of the Clone Wars. From the end of 22 BBY onwards, almost every fleet group in the Republic Navy was built around Venator-class Star Destroyers. Small fleet groups would often have a single Venator as their flagship, while most fleets were built around lines of 3 or 4 Star Destroyers. Late in the war, following the introduction of larger and more powerful command ships, Venator-class Star Destroyers often served them as escorts, but even by the end of the war, most of the Republic Navy's flagships were still Venator-class. On top of being a popular command ship, the Venator was designed to function as a starfighter carrier. It had enormous hangars with vast capacity, allowing it to field far more starfighters than any other Star Destroyer class. But while it served best as a carrier, the Venator was designed to be a versatile, multi-role ship, and it could also function as a hard-hitting capital ship killer and a planetary assault ship. While it wasn't as long-ranged and self-sufficient as the older Acclamator, making it more reliant on established supply lines, the Venator was nonetheless one of the most effective and commonly used capital ships of the Clone Wars. The Venator-class Star Destroyer had an elongated arrowhead design, although this shape was broken up somewhat toward the aft, as the main hull narrowed before splaying out again at the very aft end. Along the vessel's centerline, there was a blocky tail module at the aft end between the main engines, reminiscent of the Acclamator's tail fin, and the vessel featured a large, steeply terraced dorsal command tower at its aft as well. The Venator measured 1,137 meters long, 268 meters tall, and it had a wingspan of 548 meters. Most of the aft portion of the Venator's main hull was dedicated to the ship's reactors and propulsion systems. Unlike the reactors of other Star Destroyers, which partially protruded through the ship's ventral hull, the Venator's main hypermatter annihilation reactor was entirely internal, located in a cavity at the base of the ship's command tower. This main reactor provided the bulk of the Star Destroyer's power, but the Venator also had 2 medium-sized subsidiary reactors, which were located toward the ends of the ship's aft wing section. Together, the ship's 3 reactors had an output of 3.6 septillion watts, nearly all of which could be diverted to the Star Destroyer's turbo lasers when needed. Each reactor was supported by a cluster of reactant silos, which stored the ship's fuel in a super dense state. The auxiliary reactor fuel silos were located in a partial ring around the reactors themselves, while the main fuel silos were located due forward of the main reactor, connected both to the reactor and to the engines by a complex network of pumps and ducts. At full power, the main reactor alone annihilated 40,000 tons of fuel per second. The subsidiary reactors and their fuel tanks were partially encircled by the Star Destroyer's power cells, while the Venator's enormous engine systems filled the space between the main and auxiliary reactors. The Venator-class Star Destroyer was propelled by a total of 10 powerful ion engines, 5 to either side. The 4 large primary ion engines were located in pairs along either side of the Star Destroyer's aft. The 2 primary engines closer to the center were longer, while the further outboard primary engines were the same width, but shorter. 2 small tertiary ion engines branched off of each of the innermost engines, while a mid-sized secondary ion engine was located above each inner primary, nestled between the primary engine and the Venator's tail module. Together, these 10 engines made the Venator fast enough to chase down blockade runners despite its size, giving it a maximum acceleration of 3,000 Gs in open space and a top atmospheric speed of 975 kilometers per hour. Additionally, each ion drive thruster was ringed with electromagnetic thrust vectoring plates, which made the Venator maneuverable for its size as well. The Venator-class Star Destroyer boasted a Class 1 hyperdrive with a 60,000 light-year range. While this hyperdrive was slower and had much less range than that of the acclimated-class assault ship, it was still quite fast and allowed the Star Destroyer to operate on a galactic scale. The Venator's hyperdrive was located within the ship's tail block, which also contained the ship's main inertial compressor. On top of its impressive speed in hyperspace and real space, the Venator-class Star Destroyer was the largest Republic capital ship to be able to land on planetary surfaces. The Venator-class Star Destroyer had a tough, heavily armored hull, and it was well shielded, with shields roughly as strong as those of the Victory-class Star Destroyer. The ship required a crew of 7,400 personnel, including gunners and flight deck crew, and it could carry 20,000 tons of cargo, 2 years worth of consumables, and an additional 2,000 clone troopers, or just under a regiment's worth. As much of the Venator's interior was given over to the reactors, engines, and hangars, the crewed decks, where most of these personnel lived and worked, were clustered within the Star Destroyer's dorsal tower, within the dorsal sections directly around it, and along the sides of its main hull. In the forward half of the ship, the main crewed areas were located in a narrow strip along the sides of the hull, along the Star Destroyer's lateral trench. The Venator's main hangar took up most of the central parts of the forward section, and between the hangar area and the crewed decks was a strip containing various key systems, including the ship's flank power spines, regional shield generators, atmosphere ducts, and other systems, with only a few reinforced corridors connecting the outer crewed decks to the hangar area. These outer strips of crewed areas also ran along the sides of the aft section, while the central part of the aft section featured much larger crew areas. These ran from the aft end of the main hangar area along the base of the bridge tower, and they were mostly located within a short terrace atop the main hull. Of course, the bulk of the crewed decks were located within the dorsal tower, which was crowned with 2 bridge modules. The distinctive twin bridge modules of the Venator-class Star Destroyer housed the ship's command suites, main bridges, war rooms, and main hyperwave communications and scanner modules. Each of the ship's twin bridges had a different function. The starboard bridge was the standard helm and command bridge, while the port bridge was devoted to starfighter control. As previously mentioned, much of the Venator's interior sections were dominated by enormous hangars. Most of the ship's hangar space was concentrated in the dorsal main hangar area, but the Star Destroyer also had 2 additional hangars, one per side and one ventral. The ventral hangar was a large, rectangular pit at roughly the center of the Star Destroyer's ventral hull, and it was primarily used as a docking bay for corvettes or transports. Vessels the size of a consular-class cruiser or larger could dock comfortably within this hangar, allowing troops and cargo to be transferred to and from the Star Destroyer. Alongside ship-to-ship personnel and cargo transfers, the ventral hangar was also used to load cargo from groundside facilities. The hangar featured a large, ceiling-mounted crane to facilitate this process. The Star Destroyer's port and starboard secondary hangars, located to either side of the bridge tower, were typically used for a similar purpose. The hangar portals for these sections featured enormous docking rings, which allowed the Venator to dock with large space stations, mooring towers, or larger starships to transfer troops and cargo en masse. Embarked troops and vehicles were often transferred to a Venator in this manner, and when the Star Destroyer landed on planetary surfaces, group forces would be deployed via the secondary hangars as well. These docking ports could also be used as ordinary hangars, primarily servicing shuttles and secondary craft, as well as mustering halls for large numbers of troops. Then there was the main hangar area, which ran down the center of the Venator's forward section. The heart of this area was an open-plan flight deck, which lay beneath a pair of enormous, heavily armored bow doors. When closed, these doors formed an armored spine over the main hangar area, but when the Venator deployed its fighter wings, this spine would split apart, revealing the flight deck below. While the doors were lined with powerful shield projectors that kept in the main hangar's atmosphere and protected it from enemy fire, the Venator was still vulnerable when the main hangar doors were open, especially since the doors opened and closed slowly. This was less of a design flaw and more of a trade-off, however, as this enormous hangar opening did allow the Venator to launch enormous amounts of starfighters at once. There was also a smaller hatch set within the doors that could allow individual craft to enter and exit the hangar without exposing the whole main flight deck. The main hangar's flight deck was mostly used for takeoffs and landings, while the actual hangar facilities lay along either side, separated from the flight deck by shields. At the aft end of the flight deck was the hangar command post, a gallery from which the Star Destroyer's crew coordinated the launching and landing of the vessel's fighter wing. Each side of the main hangar featured 21 hangar portals of different sizes, although the hangars beyond were only partially separated. Here, the Star Destroyer's complement of starfighters and vehicles was stored and maintained. The Venator-class Star Destroyer had an enormous complement, the exact makeup of which varied throughout the Clone Wars. Like the Acclamator, the Venator could be used to deploy ground forces, although its carrying capacity for ground troops was much lower. Alongside an embarked regiment of 2,000 clone troopers, the Star Destroyer could only carry 40 LAATs, a mix of LAAT gunships and LAAT carriers, and 24 military walkers, typically ATTEs. It also carried shuttles of various classes for personnel transport, but the lion's share of the Venator's complement was taken up by starfighters. The Venator could carry over 400 starfighters of various classes, all of which could be launched at once when the main hangar doors were open. Generally, the Venator carried a total of 420 craft, 192 snub fighters, 192 interceptors, and 36 heavy starfighters. Depending on the stage of the war, this could mean 192 V-19 Torrents, Z-95 Headhunters or V-Wings, 192 A-6 Interceptors, Delta-7 Light Interceptors or ETA-2 Interceptors, and 36 ARC-170s, Y-Wing Bombers, PTB-625 Planetary Bombers, or NTB-630 Naval Bombers. Finally, the Venator was also heavily armed. The Star Destroyer's main weapons were a set of 8 Tame and Buck DBY-827 heavy dual turbo laser turrets, 4 of which were located either side of the ship's dorsal tower. These enormous batteries had their own internal fire control rooms, and they were highly effective for both ship-to-ship combat and orbital bombardment. These turbo lasers had 7 different power settings, allowing a Star Destroyer's captain to choose between disabling or vaporizing an enemy ship. The main turrets also had both a close-range tracking mode, in which the turret could fully rotate in just 3 seconds, and an ultra-precise long-range tracking mode, allowing the turbo lasers to hit a target at a range of over 10 light minutes. These fearsome turbo lasers were effective in both broadside engagements and full frontal assaults, and they could inflict grievous damage on even the largest Separatist warships. A small group of Venator-class Star Destroyers could rapidly bring down the powerful shields of a Lucrehulk-class battleship, largely thanks to the DBY-827's sheer power. The Venator was also armed with 2 medium dual turbo lasers, one along each side of the forward section, and 4 heavy ship-to-ship proton torpedo tubes, each with a magazine of 16 torpedoes each. These rounded out the Star Destroyer's heavy weaponry. The Venator featured 52 point defense dual laser cannon turrets to defend the ship against fast-moving fighters. At least 28 of these were located along the sides, divided evenly between the lateral trenches. The lateral trenches also contained the Star Destroyer's broadside deck guns, of which there were at least 6 per side. These guns could fire flak rounds for missile interception, or they could pummel the shields and armor of enemy capital ships at extreme close range. The Venator was armed with 6 tractor beam projectors, at least 2 of which were located at the bow of the ship. These allowed the Star Destroyers to capture smaller craft. Finally, many Venator-class Star Destroyers in the Open Circle Armada were modified to carry SPHA turbo lasers in their ventral hangars. These protected the Venator's underside from enemy capital ships and could be a powerful weapon in ship-to-ship combat or planetary bombardment. The Venator-class Star Destroyer served the Republic well throughout the Clone Wars. Its capabilities as a starfighter carrier were unmatched, and it was effective in the many other roles the Navy had it fill as well. It was a firm favorite of Jedi pilots and generals, and it played key roles in almost every battle of the war, notably including battles at Christosis, Ryloth, Boz Pity, Cato Nemoidia, and Kashyyyk. In the Battle of Coruscant, thousands of Venator-class Star Destroyers filled the skies above the galactic capital, but by this point in the war, the class's time in the spotlight was beginning to come to an end. Late in the Outer Rim sieges, KDY was already beginning to slow production of the Venator in favor of newer, more powerful Star Destroyer designs, which would go on to form the core of the Imperial Navy. But while the Venator was by far the most well-known Republic capital ship of the Clone Wars, it was far from the only Republic Star Destroyer. During the second half of the war, it fought alongside one of the most underrated capital ships in Star Wars, its older sibling, the Victory-class Star Destroyer. Designed jointly by Wallex and Lyra Blissex through the Victor Initiative project, Victory-class Star Destroyers were manufactured by Kuat Drive Yards and Rendili Star Drive. The first ships of the class were deployed in 20 BBY, 6 months ahead of schedule, to stop a powerful separatist fleet rampaging through the inner core. These first Victory-class Star Destroyers made up the Victory Fleet, commanded from the Star Destroyer Arleon, and they successfully beat back the separatist incursion. Following this successful first outing, many more Victory-class Star Destroyers were commissioned, and they would see extensive use in the Republic Navy until the end of the Clone Wars. Designed primarily for heavy ship-to-ship combat, and also for planetary assault, planetary defense, and ground troop support, the Victory-class Star Destroyer was an exceptionally formidable capital ship. It complemented the more popular Venator-class Star Destroyer well, with its exceptional firepower pairing well with the Venator's large fighter wings. While it was never as popular as the Venator, the Victory did see extensive use in the second half of the Clone Wars, often serving as a command ship. But the original Victory-class Star Destroyer was plagued with defects and malfunctioning components, and this forced the ship to experience a minor redesign later in the war. The new and improved Victory II class Star Destroyer lacked these issues, and it saw extensive use during the Outer Rim sieges, more or less replacing the Victory I class. We'll be discussing both Victory classes at once, as they share many of the same features. At 900 meters in length, the Victory was actually shorter than the Venator, but it was wider and slightly more massive. It resembled the later Imperial-class Star Destroyer more than the Venator, with an angular arrowhead-shaped main hull, a ventral reactor bulb and twin hangar pits, 3 large engines across the aft end, and a stack of dorsal terraces crowned by a hammer-headed bridge tower. The Victory's design was made unique by a set of massive maneuvering flaps that ran along its side, and the large antennae that protruded from the bridge module, but on the whole, it mostly looked like a smaller Imperial class. The Victory-class Star Destroyer was powered by a large internal solar ionization reactor, which partly protruded through the ship's aft ventral hull, as well as by a set of reserve power cells. The Star Destroyer was propelled through space by a set of 3 huge main ion engines and 4 smaller auxiliary ion engines located on the aft end of the ship. The main engines formed a row along the ship's aft, each separated by a pair of auxiliary engines. The Victory I was propelled by a set of Alderaan Royal Engineers LF9 ion engines, which were the class's biggest flaw, as they were severely underpowered, making the Victory I slow and reducing its maneuverability. However, the Victory II rectified this flaw by replacing these engines with a set of more advanced Horsch-Kessel drive units, which made the ship faster and more maneuverable. Both versions of the Victory class had a fast Class I hyperdrive, giving these Star Destroyers comparable range to the Venator. While the Victory was incapable of landing on planetary surfaces, it was capable of atmospheric flight, assisted by 2 pairs of enormous atmospheric maneuvering flaps located along the sides of the ship's aft. These flaps formed a distinctive bulge when closed, and in atmospheric flight, they could be partially opened to improve the aerodynamics of the Star Destroyer. The Victory 1 class Star Destroyer was operated by 5,200 personnel, 4,798 crew, and 402 gunners, although it could function with a skeleton crew of as low as 1,785 personnel. On top of this, it could carry 2,040 embarked clone troopers, as well as 8,100 tons of cargo and 4 years of consumables. The Victory 2 had larger crew requirements, needing 6,107 total personnel, or 5,881 crew and 226 gunners to operate the ship. The Victory 2's troop capacity was reduced to 1,600, while its cargo carrying capacity remained the same. The crewed decks where these personnel lived and worked were spread throughout the Star Destroyer, although the bulk were concentrated in the dorsal terraces. These terraces were topped with a command bridge tower, which contained the ship's bridge. The tower was also topped with 2 deflector shield generator domes and a cluster of communications antennae, and it also featured a forward observation station to the starboard side of the bridge at the end of a long antenna. The Victory-class Star Destroyer featured 2 ventral hangars, which were much smaller and had a lower capacity than those of the Venator-class Star Destroyer. The forward hangar was smaller and used a secondary launch bay, while the larger ventral hangar acted as the main hangar and docking bay. Corvettes and transports could dock with the Star Destroyer in the main bay, which was also used to launch and retrieve starfighters and transports for ground forces. Craft returning to the Star Destroyer would enter the hangar through a set of doors on the bay's forward end, where they would be repaired, refueled, and cycled into storage bays along the sides of the main hangar. For launch, they would be transferred to the attack hangar and launched through the aft doors of the main bay. The smaller secondary hangar worked in a similar way, but was primarily used to service shuttles. Typically, the Victory-class Star Destroyer carried a total of 5 shuttles, as well as several dropships and troop transports to deploy the Star Destroyer's ground forces. Along with 2,040 embarked troops, the Victory could carry 10 Juggernaut tanks, 10 heavy walkers, 15 light walkers or tanks, and various support vehicles for groundside deployment. The Victory's starfighter carrying capacity was tiny, just 24 starfighters in total. The Star Destroyer also had a tough, heavily armored hull and very powerful shields, which made the Victory class tougher overall than the Venator. The Victory 1 had slightly stronger armor and shields than the Victory 2, though not by much. Both versions of the Victory class were extremely well armed, however. The Victory 1 was armed with 10 light quad turbo laser batteries, 40 heavy double turbo laser batteries, 80 assault concussion missile tubes, and 10 tractor beam projectors in total. The quad turbo lasers, 30 of the double turbo lasers, 40 of the missile tubes, and 4 of the tractor beam projectors all had broadside firing arcs, while 20 missile tubes and the remaining double turbo lasers and tractor beams had forward firing arcs. The remaining 20 missile tubes had aft arcs. This was a substantial amount of firepower, and it made the Victory 1 one of the most feared capital ship killers of the Republic Navy. While its turbo lasers had equivalent total firepower to the main guns of a Venator-class Star Destroyer, the Victory 1's real claim to fame were those 80 concussion missile tubes. These allowed the Victory to unleash enormous barrages of high-yield, armor-piercing warheads which could utterly obliterate large capital ships. These missile batteries were also extremely effective in orbital bombardments. The Victory 2, meanwhile, had a much different arsenal, consisting of 20 turbo laser batteries, 20 double heavy turbo laser batteries, 10 heavy ion cannons, and 10 tractor beam projectors. This loadout did away with the Victory 1's concussion missiles, which were effectively replaced by the Victory 2's ion cannons, which would rapidly wear down shields and cripple targets with similar efficiency. These different loadouts gave the two subclasses of the Victory slightly different mission profiles. While both were used for ground troop support, planetary assault and defense, and ship-to-ship engagements, the Victory 1 was better suited to destroying large enemy vessels and carrying out planetary bombardments, while the Victory 2 was more equipped for deep space pursue and capture missions and flagship duties. Following its debut in 20 BBY's Bulwark Fleet Rampage, which ended with the Battle of Anaxis, The Victory 1 class Star Destroyer began to see action with Republic fleet groups throughout the galaxy. After the debut of the Victory 2 class Star Destroyer during the Outer Rim sieges, the Victory 1 started to be phased out, while the Victory 2 became more prominent in fleet groups. Both classes of Victory-class Star Destroyer fought extensively alongside the more well-known Venator, and both the Victory and the Venator were beginning to be superseded by other Star Destroyers toward the end of the war. For most of the Clone Wars, the Venator and the Victory were the Republic's only Star Destroyer classes, together forming the backbone of the Republic Navy. But during the final weeks of the Outer Rim sieges, newer and even larger Star Destroyers began to pop up in Republic fleets. There were two of these new warships in total, the Imperator-class Star Destroyer and the Tector-class Star Destroyer. The Imperator-class Star Destroyer, designed by Lyra Blissex and manufactured by KDY, was designed as a larger and more formidable version of the older Victory class, and it shared many design traits with its predecessor, just on a larger scale. It too was primarily designed for ship-to-ship combat, planetary assault, and planetary defense, and it was frequently used as a command ship. However, the Imperator-class Star Destroyer also had a much greater starfighter carrying capacity compared to the Victory, and it had tougher armor and more firepower than either the Victory or the Venator. At 1,600 meters in length, the Imperator was nearly twice the size of the Victory, although it had a fairly similar hull design. The Imperator was propelled by 3 KDY Destroyer 1 ion engines and 4 auxiliary Cygnus Space Workers Gemon 4 ion engines, which gave it a maximum acceleration of 2,300 Gs in open space and a top atmospheric speed of 975 km per hour, similar to the speed of the Venator. However, Imperator had a slower hyperdrive than the Venator and the Victory, rated as a Class 2. The Imperator's hull was thick and densely armored, and its shields were quite strong. The ship required a gargantuan crew of 37,085 personnel, consisting of 275 gunners, 25,575 other enlisted personnel, and 9,235 officers, and it could also carry 9,700 clone troopers, 36,000 metric tons of cargo, and 2 to 6 years of consumables. This class of Star Destroyer had 2 hangars, both of them built around ventral pits like those of the Victory class. The smaller forward hangar mostly handled shuttlecraft, while starfighters and ground vehicles were deployed from the aft hangar, which could also be used as a docking bay by small corvettes. An Imperator-class Star Destroyer could carry at least 8 shuttles, at least 32 landing craft, 20 heavy walkers, 30 light walkers, a prefabricated garrison base, and an air wing of 72 starfighters. During the Clone Wars, this air wing usually consisted of 48 V-wings, 12 ARC 170s, and 12 ETA-2 interceptors. Like with the Venator, the main weapons of the Imperator-class Star Destroyer were a set of 8 massive turrets located along either side of the dorsal terraces. 6 of these were dual heavy turbo laser turrets, while the other 2 were dual heavy ion cannon turrets. The Imperator was armed with an additional 60 turbo lasers, 60 ion cannons, 40 point defense laser cannons, and 10 heavy tractor beams. The Imperator-class Star Destroyer was one of the most formidable capital ships of the Clone Wars, but it ultimately had little impact on the conflict due to how late in the war it was introduced. The first Imperator-class Star Destroyers entered service in the Republic Navy well into 19 BBY at the very end of the Outer Rim sieges, and most of these were held in reserve as part of the Supreme Chancellor's secret reserve fleet. This fleet was deployed during the final stages of the Battle of Coruscant, in which the first Imperator-class Star Destroyers helped the embattled home fleet pin General Grievous's armada in Coruscant's upper atmosphere. Over the course of the next few days, some of these Imperator-class Star Destroyers, among them the Executrix and the Exactor, served as flagships for new fleets heading to the Outer Rim sieges. However, the Imperator didn't serve the Republic for long. Just a few days after the Battle of Coruscant, Clone Wars came to an end. But the history of the Imperator-class Star Destroyer, soon to be renamed the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, had just begun, and it would go on to become one of the most feared symbols of the Empire. Developed simultaneously with the Imperator, the Tector-class Star Destroyer actually saw more extensive use than its more well-known cousin during the Clone Wars. The Tector was a variant of the Imperator, identical in most respects, with only one key difference. It lacked the Imperator's ventral hangars, instead sporting heavier armor on its underside and around its reactor bulb. This made the Tector tougher and slightly better suited to ship-to-ship combat, but it also meant that the Tector was incapable of carrying starfighters or ground vehicles, forcing it to rely on other carriers for fighter support. Since the Republic Navy had plenty of Venator-class Star Destroyers lying around, however, the Tector's lack of hangars wasn't too big of a deal, allowing these Star Destroyers to make an impact. Tector-class Star Destroyers served as command ships for Republic fleet groups during the Outer Rim sieges, and they were growing increasingly common in the last days of the war. So that just about wraps it up for the Republic's Star Destroyers. But the Republic did make use of even larger capital ships during the Clone Wars, although they were a rare sight for most of the war. These massive Battlecruisers and Dreadnaughts typically served as heavily armed command ships for the largest Republic armadas, providing considerable firepower, fighter support, and rallying support for Republic fleet groups. Battlecruisers and Dreadnaughts were a rare sight for most of the war, mostly only seeing use in the defense fleets of wealthy core worlds. During the last year of the Clone Wars, however, these massive capital ships slowly became more common. During the Outer Rim sieges, the fleets assigned to the sieges of the most vital and well-defended Separatist strongholds were often led by Battlecruisers, or rarely Dreadnaughts. So let's talk about the Battlecruisers first. Traditionally, the term Battlecruiser referred to any sort of large capital ship killer, but the Anaxis War College system redefined the term to refer to massive command ships. The first modern battlecruiser was the Procurator-class Star Battlecruiser, designed by Kuat Drive Yards 2 centuries before the Clone Wars. This was the first of a series of enormous warships that KDY built for the various core world navies during the Great Peace of the Republic, and originally, these vessels were essentially just for show. The Ruusan reformations limited the hyperspace capability and firepower of large capital ships to the extent that battlecruisers and dreadnoughts were completely impractical for ship-to-ship combat, and so the Procurator and its successors were basically just expensive vanity projects. But KDY designed their battlecruisers and dreadnoughts so that they could easily be retrofitted with superior weaponry and hyperdrives if the Ruusan reformations were ever abolished, and this bet ultimately paid off. Since the core worlds, as well as some of the colonies, had credits to burn and egos to satiate, there ended up being dozens of battlecruisers in service in the Republic's heart at the start of the war, and these were quickly up-armed and retrofitted with better Navi computers. Initially, the core worlds held on to most of their battlecruisers, but after the planetary security forces were nationalized, these enormous ships became part of the Republic Navy. Some were kept in the core on defensive patrols, and these battlecruisers saw action against several separatist incursions into the region, while others were dispatched to the Outer Rim sieges. It's unknown if the original Procurator-class Star Battlecruiser was still around at the time of the Clone Wars. In fact, all that's known for certain about the ship is that it was 2,500 meters in length. There's a good chance that it had already been phased out by that point, however, as Kuat Drive Yards had already premiered the Procurator's successor, the 4-kilometer-long Praetor-class Star Battlecruiser. Apart from its length, we don't have much in the way of definitive information about the Praetor or any of the Republic's larger ships. We do know, however, that while the Praetor was originally designed to fit the requirements of the Ruusan reformations, several battlecruisers of the class were heavily upgraded late in the Clone Wars. Upgraded Praetor-class battlecruisers, such as the command-ship Quaestor, received superior Navi computers, powerful hyperdrives, heavy armor plating, and increased firepower, and they led Republic fleet groups deep into Separatist space to strike key strongholds during the Outer Rim sieges. The Quaestor in particular was the flagship of an armada tasked with capturing Pamant, one of the Confederacy's main shipyard worlds. Instead, the battlecruiser was heavily damaged during the battle, and it suffered a hyperdrive malfunction that caused it to jump directly into Pamant, fracturing the planet's crust and rendering it uninhabitable. Most of the other Praetor battlecruisers deployed during the Outer Rim sieges won their battles with much less collateral damage. The Praetor was the most common class of Republic battlecruiser, but the Republic Navy also made use of the Maelstrom-class battlecruiser, another KDY product. These warships were formidable, but they were also obscenely expensive to the point that only a few ships of the class actually saw action during the Clone Wars. Those that did see action made a big impact, however. Maelstrom battlecruisers were typically deployed as command ships, but they were also effective carriers and capital ship killers. Much like the smaller Star Destroyers, the Maelstrom had an arrowhead-shaped hull, and like the Venator, it had 2 command bridges atop its stern command tower. Maelstrom battlecruisers were sluggish in both real space and hyperspace, with substandard Class 3 hyperdrives, and they required crews of over 45,000 personnel, but they made up for this in firepower and complement. A Maelstrom could carry up to 15,000 clone troopers into battle, as well as plenty of cargo and 2 years of consumables. Its hangars were stocked with shuttles, landing craft, gunboats, and assault craft to support this army, as well as a wing of 96 starfighters. The Maelstrom-class battlecruiser was armed with at least 20 heavy turbolaser batteries, 10 battleship ion cannon batteries, 20 medium ion cannons, 30 proton torpedo tubes, 10 quad assault concussion missile batteries, 10 heavy tractor beam emitters, and 20 medium tractor beam emitters. This arsenal and complement made the Maelstrom one of the most formidable capital ships in the Republic Navy. But even the Republic's battlecruisers were dwarfed by its most impressive command ships. While the use of dreadnoughts didn't really take off until the time of the Empire, KDY did manufacture one dreadnought line for the Republic during the Clone Wars, the Mandator-class Star Dreadnaughts. These humpbacked, 8-kilometer-long Leviathans were the largest capital ships in the galaxy in their time, and although they were extremely rare, they were all but unstoppable when they did make an appearance. However, unlike the Republic's battlecruisers, which led strike fleets during the Outer Rim sieges, all of the Republic's dreadnoughts were assigned to defend key core worlds, as the Navy only had 10 of them in total. Like with the Victory-class Star Destroyer, there were 2 classes of Mandator that served during the Clone Wars. KDY designed and manufactured the original Mandator-class Star Dreadnaughts 20 years before the start of the war, intending for them to be the flagships of the Kuat Sector Defense Fleet and the protectors of the Kuat shipyards themselves. The original Mandator was the first ever capital ship to be classified as a dreadnought under the Anaxis War College system, but since it was developed during the age of the Ruusan Reformations, it was heavily limited in hyperspace capability and armament. This vast starship hosted a large and powerful reactor that, theoretically, could have supported an impressive arsenal, but its firepower was fairly minimal given its vast size, and its hyperdrive navicomputer was restricted to in-sector hyperspace routes. Still, the Mandator was a colossal vessel, and even with the armament restrictions, it still packed a punch. Only 7 original model Mandator-class Star Dreadnaughts were ever built. 3 were made for the Kuat Sector Defense Force, including Kuat Drive Yard's Guardian Dreadnought, while the PSFs of the Alsaka Sector, Ixtlar Sector, Azure Sector, and Humbarine Sector each acquired a single Mandator. When the Clone Wars erupted, these 7 dreadnoughts became part of the Republic Navy, and 3 of the 7 were upgraded with heavier armor and weaponry. However, the original dreadnoughts were all kept in the core worlds and assigned to defensive patrols, limiting their utility. The original Mandator did see some action during the Clone Wars, however, as several battles took place in dreadnought-equipped sectors. Anaxis, in the Azure Sector for instance, was the site of a major battle, as was Humbarine itself, although it's unconfirmed if a Mandator was present for either battle. If Humbarine's dreadnought did show up to defend against the forces of General Grievous, it didn't do a good job, given that Humbarine's surface was completely destroyed in that battle. Then there was the Mandator II class Star Dreadnought, a redesign of the original that KDY worked on over the course of the Clone Wars. The first Mandator IIs only showed up toward the end of the war, but they made an impact, serving the Republic Navy as guardians of the core. The Mandator II was based on the design of the original Mandator, but without the restrictions imposed by the Ruusan Reformations. The result was the most powerful capital ship in the galaxy. The Mandator II was the same size and shape as the original Mandator, but with an even more powerful reactor, much faster speed, galaxy-wide hyperspace capability, heavier armor, and much more firepower. With a reactor output of a staggering 773 septillion watts, the Mandator II was a beast, and fortunately for the Separatists, it was also very rare. KDY only built 3 Mandator 2s for the Republic during the Clone Wars, and all 3 were assigned to defensive duties in the Corps. So, that's our look at the mighty Star Destroyers and larger vessels of the Republic Navy. But what do you think? Would you like to see a video on Separatist capital ships as well? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.